before I turned it over to him. As a reminder, if you can stay muted until we begin the Q&A portion of our meeting. We've got some great speakers in addition today coming up. We've got Purdue basketball coach Matt Painter next week. We've got a really important panel, even more important given the events of the last week. We've got a discussion on race on September the 10th. A reminder to please submit your questions to Taylor by September 1. We want to drive the conversation based on your questions. We've got Steve Lavin, former UCLA basketball coach and currently a Fox Sports analyst, who will give us hopefully a read on how COVID will impact college basketball and college sports this year, and then a couple really good programs as we move into October as well. Reminder, all community grant applications are due by September 1st, so get those in. All our in-person club meetings have been canceled till October 1, and we'll let Eric, who I think is on the call, make the decision following October 1. I really want to thank you. We've raised $97,000 of our $105,000 goal toward our campaign, working on potentially a gift that'll put us really close, if not over the top. And a reminder, if you want to consider giving to the campaign in lieu of paying your lunch dues, we would appreciate that. If you're a guest, I think we've got a number of guests. I'm going to ask you just to introduce yourself on the chat function. I think my mom is on this call, so Dr. Leary, I hope you don't reveal my grades in your class, because I was told I was a pretty good student, so I hope you don't blow my cover there. And I also want to thank Trent Cowles. Trent initially signed up to be our September lunch sponsor, and then emailed me this morning and said, I want to sponsor October as well to get Eric off to a good start in his presidency. Trent, you are a great Kiwanian and continue to be incredibly generous. So yeah, introduce yourself if you're on the chat. And I think we again have several of our Jamaican members, so we certainly appreciate having you as well. This is a really special program for me because there's your most famous student, or two of them, or at least one of them, Dr. Leary, if you can see the screen there.
I do see the screen.
I've been really fortunate. I've had some amazing professors in my time, and I've also been around some amazing professors in my work in higher education, but Mark Leary is the very best I've ever had. An amazing professor. I'm going to read, he's got a very distinguished background, which I'm going to read, but one of the things that really stuck out with me, and I'm hoping he'll reveal a secret, his very first class, I was in a lecture hall, probably about 100, 110 students, and he had a camera, he had a video camera, and he asked each student to introduce themselves by name. He filmed that. In the very next lecture, he went around with it and named every person. He had memorized their names, which I found incredible. So I'm hoping he'll reveal the secret. But I wasn't smart enough to go on in psychology and get my PhD, but in my development career in higher education, that lesson taught me how important someone's name is. To remember that, and I think there's an old saying that I'll get it wrong, but there are no sweeter words to one's ear than their name. And so he taught me that. He taught me a lot of other lessons, but he's the very best I've ever had. He's just an amazing professor. I will say a couple bad things about him. He was an esteemed professor at Wake Forest and then went to Duke, which if you're not familiar with North Carolina, that's a little bit like Ronald Reagan going to work for the Kremlin. It was a bit of a disappointing move, but I joke about that. But I do want to read his background here. Mark Leary is I hope I get this name right, Goranczyk Family Emeritus Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at Duke University. He earned a bachelor's degree from West Virginia Wesleyan College and his doctoral degree in social psychology from the University of Florida. He taught previously at Denison University, the University of Texas at Austin, and Wake Forest. He retired from Duke in 2019. I hope he's enjoying his retirement. He's published 14 books, and I've got two of them here, if you can see them. I keep these on my bookshelf, and we plugged Your Curse of the Self you're looking for a really good book, you can buy that on Amazon. But 14 books, including The Curse of the Self, Egotism and the Quality of Human Life, 3 recorded classes for the great courses, Understanding the Mysteries of Human Behavior, Why You Are Who You Are, Investigations into Human Personality and Your Public Persona, Self-Presentation in Everyday Life. He's a fellow of the American Psychological Association, Association of Psychological Science, and the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. He received the Lifetime Career Award from the International Society for Self and Identity and was co-recipient of the Scientific Impact Award from the Society for Experimental Social Psychology. He was founding editor of the journal Self and Identity, editor of Personality and Social Psychology Review, and in 2015 served as president of the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. He blogs regularly for Psychology Today and is editor of Character and Contact, a blog for the Society of Personality and Social Psychology. And again, we had the picture up, but his most famous student is Tim Duncan. I think he co-authored a presentation on, or a research publication with Tim Duncan. And Dr. Leary, I want you to know I'm sporting my Wake Forest colors today, and Tim Duncan was 9-1 against Duke. Not that I keep track of these things in his career, but we're really honored to have you today. Again, I can't thank you enough for the impact you've had on my life and my career, and I really appreciate your time. So Dr. Leary, take it away.
Thank you very much. Very kind introduction. This is just too kind. I'm going to share my screen if I can figure out how to do it. One thing that Graham did not mention is, can everybody see that? Okay.
Yep.
One thing he did not mention is my familiarity with Kiwanis. I'm not a Kiwanis member, but I was really involved in Key Club in high school. So I went to a lot of Kiwanis meetings. And in fact, I attended the Kiwanis International Convention. It was held in Anaheim, California in 1971 because I represented West Virginia in the oratorical contest. I had won the Key Club speech contest in West Virginia. So I'm very familiar with you guys. You do great work. And I've been going to those meetings back in the day, a long time ago. This is only the second talk that I've given over Zoom since the pandemic started. And it's really a different experience, not being able to look out there at an audience and not have that connection. And I'm sure that it's different for you too to be staring at this, but we'll do our best. I want to talk about intellectual humility. And I want to start by asking you a question. I want you to think about all of the disagreements that you have with other people. We disagree with other people a lot, from minor disagreements to about relatively unimportant things to major disagreements about really important stuff. Think about all of the times that you disagree, either explicitly and openly and you talk about it, or even you just realize that you disagree with somebody in your mind and don't say anything. Think about the last year, all your disagreements. In what percentage of the disagreements that you have with other people do you think that you are the one who's correct? Now, we don't always know. Sometimes we know who was right. Somebody Googles the answer to a question and we know. But a lot of times we don't, but we have a suspicion usually that we're correct. What percentage of the time are you correct? From 0% to 100% of the time. Now, if we all knew the truth, if a big voice would come out of the sky and tell us each time, Mark, you were right about that. Oh, but this one over here, you were wrong. And you were wrong here, but you were right about this other thing. If we all knew the truth and we averaged all of our answers to that question, the average would have to be 50%, right? On average. Now, some of us might be right more than others. I'm not saying that some of you aren't wiser than the people you deal with, and some of you may not be right as much. But on average, we ought to come out at 50% because in any two-way disagreement, each person's going to be right half the time. Well, it might not surprise you to know that when I asked 400 American adults to answer this question, what percentage of the time are you correct? Here's what the graph looked like. You see, 50% is there on the far left. Yeah, we had 4% who said that they were correct less than half the time. But essentially 82% of the respondents said that they were the ones who were right more than 50% of the time. And in fact, the average person said they were correct about 2/3 of the time. Now, there's been research on this effect for many years. We know from many studies that we are all irrationally confident about the correctness of our beliefs and opinions. People show a dramatic overconfidence effect. And we've known that. And that's a problem in terms of dealing with other people, but that's not what I really want to talk about. What I want to talk about is, as you look at this graph, different people have different assumptions about what percentage of the time they're correct. Some people are more willing to acknowledge that they are incorrect than other people are. And that's really what I mean by intellectual humility. It's recognizing that your personal beliefs, attitudes, or positions are fallible. It's recognizing that what you think might be true might not be. Now, of course, we all think whatever we believe is right. It would be absurd to say, well, I believe X is correct, but it's probably wrong. It doesn't make any sense. So we all think that our beliefs and attitudes are correct. The question is, to what extent do you hold out the possibility that you might be wrong? How open are you to the idea that, in fact, what you believe, you may believe it firmly, but do you leave the possibility open that you might be wrong? So we're going to talk about this phenomenon. We're going to talk about it on 3 levels. We'll talk something about state intellectual humility. And what I mean by that is in a given moment, at a given time, in a given conversation, as you are having that disagreement, as you are asserting an opinion or a belief, to what extent do you acknowledge to yourself that you might be incorrect? We're going to talk about domain-specific intellectual humility. Most of us are very intellectually humble on certain topics. We're very willing to admit, well, here's what I think, but I might be wrong. But each of us shows some pockets of intellectual arrogance as well, where we don't concede any possibility that our beliefs might be wrong. Most of what I'm going to talk about, though, is what we call trait intellectual humility. And by trait, I just mean a personality characteristic. In general, across time, across topics, across situations, how much of the time do you consider the possibility that you might, in fact, be wrong? That's the thing that we've spent we started this research in 2012, and we've been trying to understand primarily the differences among people in their willingness to recognize that what they think might be incorrect. Now, the reason we got into this is that it occurred to us that having excessive confidence in your beliefs and attitudes creates a number of problems, that we would like people to be at least a little intellectually humble, to not walk through life thinking that they knew everything. So, for example, low intellectual humility tends to promote unnecessary arguments and conflicts. Even if we were highly intellectually humble and realized we might be wrong, we'd still have disagreements, but we wouldn't be as entrenched in our views, and so we wouldn't have as many unnecessary arguments and conflict. Low intellectual humility, we thought it might lead people to dismiss information that's contrary to their opinions and beliefs. If I'm certain I'm right, I don't even have to listen to you. As soon as you say something I disagree with, it's wrong, and I'm not even going to consider the evidence. We thought, and I'm going to talk more about this, that low intellectual humility would be associated with derogating people who disagree with your beliefs and worldviews and opinions. It's not that you just think they're wrong, you think that they're bad people. People who have low intellectual humility, we believed before we started, might have trouble correcting their incorrect beliefs. You're not going to correct your wrong ideas if you don't at least accept the possibility that they might be wrong. And low intellectual humility may lead to an unwillingness to negotiate or compromise. Why should I compromise with you if I am absolutely certain I'm right and you're wrong? If there's not some possibility that there's some merit in your argument, I'm not going to negotiate and compromise. We're going to do things my way. So this is what spurred us to study this. It just seemed like in relationships, in friendships, casual interactions, business decision-making, work teams, that low intellectual humility might promote a number of problems, and it would be interesting to understand this phenomenon. We spent the first year of the project trying to come up with a very short, easy to use, self-report questionnaire to assess intellectual humility. It took us a year. And I think after you see the very simple set of items we ended up with, you're going to say, what was wrong with you? How did this take a year? It's more difficult than you might expect to write items that are crystal clear, that have the right statistical and psychometric properties that are necessary for psychological measurement. And we went down a lot of dead ends and had a lot of bad items and went through sample after sample after sample before we came up with this very simple questionnaire. And I just want to show you the items because most of the studies I'm going to describe are based on this 6-item questionnaire. We asked people to rate how true or characteristic each of these items is of them. I question my own opinions, positions, and viewpoints because they could be wrong. I reconsider my opinions when presented with new evidence. I recognize the value in opinions that are different from my own. I accept that my beliefs and attitudes may be wrong. And that's really the key item. All of the rest of the items center around that one. In the face of conflicting evidence, I am open to changing my opinion, and I like finding out new information that differs from what I already think is true. And one of the problems we had as we developed this is we didn't want intellectual humility to reflect a lack of self-confidence. We didn't want people who just doubted their ability to think. And these items don't do that. These are not correlated with lack of confidence. These are correlated with the belief that, yeah, I might be wrong. So let me give you a sort of a broad picture of what people who score low versus high on this scale are like, and then I'll talk about a few particular studies that look at how they think. Our research, covering a number of studies since 2012, shows first that intellectually humble people enjoy thinking more. You may have never thought about the fact that people differ in how much they enjoy thinking, pondering things, introspecting, just puzzling over the mysteries of life and the universe, playing intellectual games. Some people think that's a lot of fun. Other people think it's a waste of time. People higher in intellectual humility enjoy thinking more. They're also higher in curiosity. Just as they go through their daily lives, they see things, they hear, well, what's going on here? I want to understand this thing. They have a higher tolerance for ambiguity. All of us prefer certainty over ambiguity and uncertainty, of course. But people differ in the degree to which they tolerate uncertainty and ambiguity. Some people, it's very distressing not to be certain of things. And I've come to believe that it's hard to be intellectually humble if you can't handle ambiguity and uncertainty. Because if you're intellectually humble, you are never completely sure that you're right. You firmly believe something. Yes, I believe this and I believe it firmly, but there's a possibility I might be wrong. And if you're low in tolerance for ambiguity, that just makes you too uncomfortable. Another way of saying that is I think some people who are very low in intellectual humility, who don't consider the possibility they're wrong, the reason they don't consider the possibility of they're wrong is they don't like the ambiguity and the uncertainty that produces. People high in intellectual humility are more open to ideas and experiences. They like playing with ideas, considering other options. They're also open to new experiences, like trying new foods. I'm not quite sure why, but I think the reason is if I offer you a really weird food, hey, do you want to try this, I don't know, sheep's eyeball that I cooked? People go, well, I don't know. Do I really want to try a sheep's eyeball? That doesn't sound very good. I think somebody high in intellectual humility says, that sounds terrible, but I might be wrong. I might like it. Let me give it a try. They're less dogmatic and self-righteous. When we started this research, some of the team members thought it might be correlated with religiosity, the degree to which religion is important to people. They just had the stereotype that religious people were more entrenched in their views. We've done several studies on this, and it's not true. There is no relationship between the degree to which people are religious and intellectual humility. If you think about, if that surprises you, just think for a moment about atheists. Atheists are obviously not religious people, but many of them are also not particularly intellectually humble. They say, I don't believe in God and I am certain I'm right. So there's no relationship between intellectual humility and religiosity. However, lower intellectual humility is correlated with the belief that one's views about religion, whatever they may be, even if it's anti-religious, are correct. And that makes sense. That's what intellectual humility is. It's believing that your beliefs are correct. Now, you'll remember those 6 items on the intellectual humility scale, nothing mentions religion. But this is one manifestation of low intellectual humility. If you happen to be a religious or non-religious person and you're low in intellectual humility, you are more convinced that your personal religious orientation is the one that's right. We also had some team members on the research team at the beginning who assumed that political conservatives might be less intellectually humble. They had a stereotype. That's not true either. Intellectual humility does not differ on average across Democrats, Republicans, and independents. Just doesn't. But people with more extreme views in either a conservative or liberal direction tend to be less intellectually humble. So on average, political orientation is not related to intellectual humility. But if you're more extremely liberal or more extremely conservative, there's a tendency to be less intellectually humble. There's a sort of plot, liberalism, conservatism against intellectual humility. You get a curve that looks like this. Moderates are more intellectually humble. Now, some people have said, well, that just makes sense, that extremists on either end are going to be more certain that they're right. But it wouldn't really have to be that way. Benjamin Franklin is reputed to have called himself an extreme moderate. He was intellectually arrogant about the idea that the best political answer in all cases is the one in the middle. And that was always better than anything at either extreme. So we could have a lot of moderates walking around who were very low in intellectual humility, like Benjamin Franklin was, but they don't. In real American life, moderates are more intellectually humble than people on the extremes. I think the reason is that if you hold moderate views, some combination of liberal and conservative and something in the middle, I think it's more obvious to you how gray the question is, whatever the question is. You know, it's less clear. Yeah, I can go this way. I can go a little bit this way. There's a mash up in the middle. And so I'm less certain that my beliefs are right. Even though I believe them firmly, I entertain the possibility that in fact they might be incorrect. This particular graph has to do with your general level of trait intellectual humility, but we find this same effect when we look at particular political attitudes. We gave people a set of 9 political attitudes. We asked them to tell us what their attitude was on a liberal versus conservative dimension for each topic. And then we asked them how certain they were that their attitude was better than everybody else's attitude, that their attitude was correct. And this next graph, I don't expect you to really process it fully because it's a mess. But here we have 9 different political topics: healthcare, immigration, abortion, how much should we help the needy, voter ID, and so on. And we had people rate where their attitude fell. And then we asked them how correct they were. And what you can see there is that people who had more liberal and more conservative attitudes, the people at the extremes, were more convinced that they were correct. So I'm not sure what to do with that, but it does say something about polarization in politics and the fact that as we become more polarized, people tend to become more entrenched in believing that their particular views are the right ones. So in this research program over the last 8 years, we've examined several things about intellectual humility. And one idea that we had early on is the possibility that people higher in intellectual humility evaluate the quality of arguments and evidence more carefully. And the idea is this: If I generally think that whatever I believe is right, if I'm low in intellectual humility, then when people argue with me, I don't really need to listen to their evidence. I already know they're wrong because they disagree with me, and I'm right. But people high in intellectual humility, yeah, they believe something. They hold that position firmly. But because they think they might be wrong, when people present counter evidence, they pay more attention to the evidence. That was the hypothesis we tested. So to look at this particular question, we wanted to look at attitudes about something that was not a hot button topic. It wasn't something in politics or in religion. So what we looked at were attitudes for flossing. Okay? About half of American adults floss and half don't. If I tell you you should floss, and I give you a lot of reasons, how much attention do you pay to the reasons that I give you? So we had participants read one of two essays that urged people to floss. People ought to floss on a regular basis. Half of our participants read an article that said you need to floss, and then presented strong, evidence-based arguments from dental experts and scientific studies. Or they read an essay that says you really ought to floss, but they were given weak, anecdotal arguments from ordinary people. Like the director of the local YMCA says you ought to floss. Okay, that's fine, but that's not exactly strong scientific evidence. Or a guy on the street says you ought to floss because it makes your mouth feel good. Now, again, that's fine, but it's not as good as scientific evidence that maybe you will prevent gum disease. So, get the idea? Participants read one of these two essays, either with strong or weak arguments, and then they rated the essay and the evidence that was presented. I want to talk about the non-flossers, because you wouldn't expect people who already floss are going to pay that much attention when they hear people give reasons for why you should floss. I already floss, I don't have to pay attention to that. The people who should be paying attention are the non-flossers, if arguments are being made that they should floss. Among non-flossers are participants who were higher in intellectual humility rated the strong arguments better than the weak arguments, quite rationally. That is, when we asked the people who read the strong argument essay, how good is this evidence? And we asked the people who read the weak evidence essay, how good is this evidence? The ones who read the strong evidence said the evidence was stronger than the ones who read the weak evidence. Makes sense. But, and this kind of blew me away, people low in intellectual humility rated the two essays equally. Those who saw the strong evidence rated it as strong as those who read the weak evidence. They didn't distinguish good from bad arguments, which suggests they didn't think deeply enough about the article to tell strong from weak arguments. Why? Because if you're low in intellectual humility and you start reading something about flossing, you already think you know what you believe. You don't need anybody to tell you. Whatever your belief is, pro or con, is right. And you simply don't process the evidence as deeply. So people high in intellectual humility seem more attentive to the evidentiary basis of claims. They listen more carefully to the reasons people give for taking a particular position. And presumably they're more attentive to the evidentiary basis of their own beliefs, although we haven't done a study that directly tested that. And then somebody on the research team had the idea that people, I mentioned this earlier, people low in intellectual humility might react more strongly against people who disagree with them than people high in intellectual humility. Because people high in intellectual humility think, well, I disagree with what you say, but hey, maybe you're right. And we found that. I won't describe the study in detail, but people lower in intellectual humility derogate people who disagree with them more strongly. The thing that's most troubling about this is not that just that they say the person is more incorrect, but they not only rate them as more incorrect, but they also rate people who disagree with them as less competent, less likable, and less ethical. People low in intellectual humility, their evaluation of a person as an individual is entirely tainted by the fact that person disagrees with them on a particular attitude. Or to say it the other way, it's as if people higher in intellectual humility are better at separating the message from the messenger. Yes, I disagree with you. I think you're wrong. I really do. But maybe you're right. So maybe you're not a bad person. I don't need to derogate your likability or the fact that you're ethical. We also wondered whether people who are higher in intellectual humility would be less bothered by people who change their minds. Like in political flip-flopping, have some politician who's changed his position. Some people just hate that. He's just pandering to the electorate. Doesn't know what he's doing. And other people say, well, an intellectually humble person might say, well, if I got new information, I would change my mind. So maybe it's okay that he changed his mind. So we did a study where participants read a scenario about a politician who changed his view on an issue. Participants didn't know what the issue was. They weren't told anything about the direction of the guy's change. All they knew is there's a politician running for office who, since the last election, changed his view. His opponent says, you're just flip-flopping to be elected. He says, no, I've learned more about this from 4 years ago, and so I've changed my mind. And the question is, to what extent would you vote for somebody like that? And to what extent do you think that he's flip-flopping just to get elected? And we found a difference. People higher in intellectual humility were more accepting of the politician who changed his position than those who were low. And again, I think they're just projecting their own reactions on the politician. They say on the questionnaire, if I find something that's contrary to what I believe and it's strong evidence, I will change my mind. And so they're more accepting of other people who change their mind. I'm rushing through this because we have a lot of stuff, and I just want to give you a smattering of how to think about this. I think the study that I like the most that we've run on this topic, I got the idea for this one in a card shop. When I saw this card, I had to buy it because it gave me the idea for research. She says, I married Mr. Right. I just didn't know his first name was Always. And that got me to thinking about the relational implications of intellectual humility. What's it like to live with somebody who tends to think that no matter what the topic, that they are correct, that don't consider the possibility they may be wrong? So we did a study where we recruited 74 heterosexual couples. These are real couples, not college students. Wide range of ages. They'd been in a relationship from 6 months to 25 years. We brought both of these people in, both people in each of these couples, separated them, put them in different rooms, measured their intellectual humility, and then had them answer questions about their partner and about the relationship. And I think if I could see all of your faces right now, there'd probably be a lot. Some of you would be nodding kind of imperceptibly, go, oh yeah, okay, because this is telling me a lot about some relationship that I've had in the past. The cool thing about having both partners is that it allowed us to look at the effects of intellectual humility, first on each individual. Do low and high intellectually humble men think about their relationships and their partners differently? Do high and low intellectually humble women think about their partners and relationships differently? But the more interesting thing is, how does one partner's intellectual humility affect how their partner perceives the relationship and them? What is the effect of being low in intellectual humility or high intellectual humility on one's partner's reactions to the relationship? And let me just run through just a few of the highlights. We had a lot of data in this study. One thing people ask me when I start to talk about this is there any relationship between the men's and women's scores? And what I mean is there are a lot of characteristics where people tend to match to some extent. You tend to seek a partner who shares your characteristics. We tend to match a little bit on socioeconomic standing and educational attainment. Even extroversion, introversion. Extroverts tend to prefer extroverts and introverts tend to prefer introverts, and get extroverts and introverts together, they drive each other a little crazy. Is there any relationship? Do people gravitate toward people of a similar intellectual humility level? And the answer is no. What a evolutionary psychologists would say is there's no assortative mating with respect to intellectual humility. It's like we pick people randomly for relationships without respect to how their intellectual humility relates to ours. And that's nice from a research standpoint. That means you have all possible combinations. You got the full range of scores mixed and matched in all possible kinds of ways to study how this works in a relationship. What difference does it make? Well, we measured people's satisfaction with their relationship. Men's satisfaction with their relationship was predicted by their own intellectual humility. Men who were higher in intellectual humility were more satisfied with their relationships than men who were lower in intellectual humility. All right. The women agreed. Women's satisfaction was predicted by their male partner's intellectual humility. Women in relationships with men who were higher in intellectual humility were more satisfied with those relationships than women who were in relationships with low intellectually humble men. Women's intellectual humility was not related to either women's satisfaction or their partner's satisfaction. We asked people overall, how well do you get along as a couple? Again, men's ratings were predicted by their own intellectual humility. Men who were more intellectually humble said we get along better than men who were low in intellectual humility. And again, their partners agreed. Women's ratings were predicted by their partners' intellectual humility. Women said they got along better when they were in relationships with high rather than low intellectually humble men. Now that's just 2 items, but there were about a dozen where we got this same pattern, where men's intellectual humility mattered more in the relationship than women's did. Across many measures, men's intellectual humility appears to play a bigger role in disagreements and satisfaction, both his satisfaction and hers, than women's intellectual humility. And I'm not quite sure why. Some of the items sort of suggest that men who are low in intellectual humility have a particularly toxic way of dealing with arguments and disagreements. They're the kinds that stomp out of rooms and slam doors and call their partners names. And so men who are low versus high in intellectual humility differ more in how they respond to arguments than women who are low versus high in intellectual humility. Men who are really low in intellectual humility are just not exactly a professional term, but they're like just bigger horses' asses when it comes to arguments in the relationship, which is kind of interesting. Other thing we found is that couples in which both partners scored low in intellectual humility were particularly troubled, as you might expect. They had far more arguments, far lower satisfaction. They had more maladaptive argument behaviors when they disagreed with each other. The double whammy of having 2 low intellectually humble people in a relationship is just almost dooms a relationship from the data that we have. Having just one intellectually humble person who can kind of shrug this stuff off helps a great deal. It sometimes only takes one. They're still not as well off as the couples in which both partners are high in intellectual humility, but just having one high intellectually humble person in the relationship does help. And some of the funniest findings of this project were cases where when we asked people to rate their partners, they described their partners in ways that actually seemed to be created by the person's own behavior. It's not that their partner was really that way as a person. It's the fact that my behavior created certain reactions in the partner. Let me just give you 3 examples. High intellectual humility women rated their partners as more agreeable and less selfish. Were their partners really more agreeable and less selfish as a person? Didn't seem to be so. What seemed to happen is that high intellectual humility women didn't push buttons that make people disagreeable and selfish in the way that low intellectual humility women may. On the other side, exactly the same effect. High intellectually humble men rated their partners as less stubborn and more flexible. There wasn't any evidence they really were less stubborn and more flexible as people, but high intellectually humble men don't do things that make their partners stubborn and inflexible the way that low intellectually humble men do. So intellectual humility not only affects our reactions and how we behave, it changes our partner's responses to us in ways that affect the quality of the relationship. One last finding. When the man was high in intellectual humility, both members of the couple rated each other as more intelligent and well-informed. Think about that. Are they really? No reason to think so. But when the man was high in intellectual humility, his partner thought he was a more intelligent guy and he was more well-informed. And he thought that the partner was. Or to say it the other way, men in low in intellectual humility thinks that their partners are less intelligent and less well-informed. Why do low intellectually humble men think that she is less intelligent, less well-informed? Because she disagrees with him. And because he's right, then there's something wrong with her. She's stupid. So here are cases in which people are creating reactions in their partners, and they're not aware they're creating those reactions, but it comes down to the impact of my intellectual humility or lack of it on my partner's responses. So that's been a whirlwind tour through this program of research. I'll just conclude with a quote from Isaac Asimov, the science fiction writer, who said, "People who think they know everything are a great annoyance to those of us who do." I appreciate the invitation. Thanks for showing up today. And I'll be glad to answer questions and then hear what you have to say about this.
Well, we do have some questions, and that was a fascinating presentation, Dr. Leary. We've had a couple of guests join us, and I just want to acknowledge a couple special guests. Kate Morris is our provost.
Kate.
Here at Butler University, and I think you said you've known her since she was 3 years old.
Yes, I think that's about right.
She joined us. Christy Buchanan, one of your former colleagues.
Christy.
Who is also one of my great professors. And then Georgianne Brown. So Dr. Leary, you not only affected my professional life, but I married a clinical psychologist, which I could write a book about that. But Georgianne...
So could she.
Yeah, I'm sure, especially about intellectual humility or lack thereof. But Georgianne introduced me to my wife. And at this point, I think my wife hates Georgianne. But we've got three special guests. But we do have a lot of questions for you, and I'm going to start out. Is there a way to identify someone's level of intellectual humility when we engage with them in our daily lives, work? If so, is there a way to help someone with lower intellectual humility be more open to other viewpoints?
Great questions, great questions. I think once you begin to think about this characteristic, your antennas can go up and you can automatically realize this person is more sure of themselves on a consistent basis than the average person. So it's not like there's just something you can spot or you can identify them. But, we all do this. There's just no question we all lean toward that overconfident side, as I said at the beginning. But if you begin to think about it and realize this person consistently thinks they're more right than other people, I think you can sort of get a sense of how you would sort out the people that you know in terms of intellectual humility. As far as how to lower it, there's now research coming out. I was just on a call the other day with a researcher in Israel who was studying how do we make people less intellectually arrogant in the context of a particular conversation. Because for those of us who would like to think we're a little more intellectually humble than average, which I think most of us would, we still know that we do get entrenched in our views sometimes. And if you think about what pushes your button, it's often when you feel like you're being pushed into a corner and badgered and people aren't listening to what you have to say. And so you cling tighter and tighter to that point you're trying to make. His research shows that the thing that makes people respond in a state-like way at the moment, in a more intellectually humble way, is to be a really good listener, to show that you really want to know what that person has to say, you respect what they have to say, you may disagree with it, but you don't cut them off, you don't cut them off short, you don't criticize, you listen and you try to be reasoned. That lowers people's defensiveness to some extent. So I would say going through life, I have tried to start doing that. You just don't you don't continue to push the button and get that person into a corner and they'll loosen up some. In terms of people who are just chronically too confident, I don't know what you do. I mean, that's sort of from a lifetime of being convinced that you're right, and I don't have a good solution to that.
Next question, which I think you've sort of addressed, but if you want to add anything else, why is it important to know about someone's intellectual humility? How can it be used, and couldn't we be wrong?
I think just being attuned to other people's and to our own. I mean, we can only control this in ourselves to some extent. We all get our buttons pushed where we get entrenched about things that we shouldn't. I just think it's something that helps the quality of our interactions, the quality of decisions in businesses and organizations and other contexts. If people are just more open to the possibility that whatever they are asserting might not be correct, or at least it might not be wrong, but maybe it's not the best thing. And a lot of discussions, it's not that one's right or one's wrong. Sometimes it's that one person's idea is just a little better than another's, let's say in making some work-related decision. So just being attuned to the fact that we are overly confident, other people are overly confident, and to try to take steps to loosen that up a little bit.
Good question here. What books, authors do you recommend for advice helping to raise, encourage these ethos in our progeny?
Unfortunately, I don't know of any. And I've talked to a lot of people in developmental psychology about, is there research out there on how to raise people who are more realistically confident, whose confidence is calibrated to the truth of what they believe? I don't know of anything. And if anybody knows of anything, email me and let me know, because I would like to know. People always want to know, how can we change this in people in general? And the developmental psychologists have recommendations. One is to simply require your kids to give reasons for things, to make it clear that you're not just going to, and when you talk to your kids, give them reasons for things, to show that beliefs have to be based on something, and here are the reasons. I started something with my kids when they were maybe like 12 and 8. I realized that I was doing the parental thing. I would tell them to do something, and they would object, but I would say, oh no, I'm the dad, go do it, because I said so. But then I realized sometimes the thing I was telling them to do was stupid. I'd say, it's time to go to bed, turn off the TV, and they'd say, well, the show's going to be over in 5 minutes. Well, it's silly to say, well, no, turn it off now. What I told them at the time is that I will allow you to protest once anytime that I tell you to do something. That will allow me to reconsider and make sure I just didn't blurt out a stupid command. And I'll change my mind sometimes. Now, I don't know, nobody's done research on that, but I think that would create more intellectually humble kids to realize that dad is reconsidering his views. He's admitting that some percentage of the time he said something that was wrong, and he's listening to me. It sort of models the kind of thing I think we should do more. We often blurt out things, even to other adults, that we take stances we shouldn't take. We take stronger stances than we should take. And we just need to be attuned to that.
A really relevant question here. Why is there so much hate with different opinions recently, especially this generation?
Boy, if any of us could find the answer to that, I mean, we'd be famous and probably rich. We have grown increasingly intolerant of people who disagree with us, even when it doesn't matter. That's the thing that baffles me. Sometimes our disagreements have actionable consequences. It really does matter whether you believe X or Y. But we get angry with people. You see things on the web where people are arguing, are the 1972 Miami Dolphins, they're the best football team ever, and they're angry and they're calling each other names. And you say, well, it's a nice conversation, but why are you so inflamed about things that don't matter? In my relationships with my wife, we've been married for 40 years. Most of the stuff we argue about is stuff that doesn't matter. That's the thing we need to eliminate. I mean, we also need to eliminate the hatred, obviously. But the bigger question is, why are we just so easily entrenched in our views and really get angry at people who disagree with us when it doesn't matter? Then we'll have to work on when it does matter. And usually that's a little more difficult because people think that things are really at stake. Great question. I wish I had the answer.
I do think you've got your next book. I think this is if there's no other literature, I think this is your next book here, even if you're retired. Here's one from Leslie. I'm curious as to how much overlap there is between intellectual humility and narcissism.
Less than you would think. we were absolutely convinced that a big chunk of intellectual humility would look like narcissism. And of course, narcissism is thinking that you're better than everybody else. The correlation is very, very small. And I think the reason is that the core of narcissism is believing that you're a superior person, that you're special, that you've got special traits and abilities and you're a great success. It doesn't necessarily mean that you think that everything that you think is correct. So there's a difference. This is very specific to me believing in the correctness of my beliefs. Narcissists are clearly a little higher in lower in intellectual humility, but it's different. The focus is different. Is it my beliefs I'm thinking about or me as a person that I think is superior?
Is intellectual humility positively related to the openness of the Big Five?
Yes, strongly. And the openness of the Big Five, if most of you aren't aware of this, there are 5 fundamental personality traits that characterize human behavior. And one of them is an openness to ideas and experience. A high chunk of that personality trait is genetic. About 50% of the variability we see in openness across people has a genetic basis. What that means is there's a chunk of intellectual humility that is kind of pre-wired. Doesn't mean you can't change it. Doesn't mean you can't unlearn it. But it means some people have a tendency to be more intellectually arrogant versus humble from the very beginning.
To what extent can intellectual humility be improved?
That's a really good question. And you know, this is such a new area. The major paper that first came out was in 2017. So people are picking up on it. There's an awful lot of action right now. And there are studies, I'm consultant on some other people's studies. They're trying things in schools and kindergartens and families to talk about how do you improve this? What can you do to make people at least acknowledge the possibility they might be wrong? Why is that such a big deal to people? Why do you have to believe that you're absolutely certain as opposed to believing something? Yes, I really do believe this, but holding out that little bit of doubt. Yeah, but I can't possibly know everything, so maybe I am incorrect. Why is that such a hard thing, and how do we change it? People are just beginning to study
that. This question, and it does not come from my wife, who's not on the call, but how do you deal with someone who thinks they're always right and thinks that you're the stupid
one? I don't know. I really don't know. I think there are deeper problems in a relationship whether it's a friendship or a romantic relationship or a parent-child relationship, there are probably slightly deeper problems than simply low intellectual humility. And I don't know the answer. I'm not a clinical psychologist. I don't have any background for practice. And I don't know. And I realize I've said I don't know to a lot of this, but that's because this really is a new area. And I'm always hesitant to speculate too wildly. I speculate a lot, but don't want to do it too wildly outside of the data. But I don't know. That's a great question.
Trying to teach my daughter to pick and choose her battles. Best way to do this?
Good question. I think it is to ask yourself, to what extent does this really matter? And when I do that to myself, I find that only about 20% of the things that really irk me, that I really get entrenched about, only about 20% really matter. And I think if you do it that way, you'll realize, yes, this is completely ridiculous. I feel like I want to argue with you. You're a complete idiot. But, you know, in my own mind, I know this doesn't matter, so I'm just not going to go there. And again, that's a personal answer rather than a professional one, but that's worked for me some.
Those are the questions in the chat, but I've got 2 more for you. We got about 4 minutes left.
Okay.
You are an expert in anxiety, and you may not have studied this, but is there a correlation between anxiety and intellectual humility? I would surmise that people high in intellectual, or that are low in intellectual humility, might be less anxious because they're more confident in their opinion. They're less worried about what others think. Do you see any correlation there?
Well, that's a good question, because I could see it going either way. I could see it going the way you're describing, that if I'm more confident and I feel more assertive and I'm not worried about what other people think, that may go along with being more certain in myself. On the other hand, being concerned, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know.
Okay,
Yeah.
we do have one more question in the chat. What role can education at all levels help learn tolerance for others' opinions?
I was on a panel. Well, I was a member of a research group for 3 years with a guy in California. I think he's at UCLA, and he runs a private experimental school that's based around helping kids learn intellectual virtues. And those include everything from diligence in your work to critical thinking. He's a philosopher, so he thinks about it in terms of intellectual virtues. One thing he's working on is what can you do in an educational system to get people to be more intellectually humble, both in terms of understanding your own limitations, having an honest appraisal of what you know and what you don't know, and dealing with other people's assertions when they're intellectually arrogant. And I haven't seen his work lately, but he was doing some really interesting things, trying to build that into the curriculum in terms of how the teacher teaches, how she deals with people's questions, how she deals with kids being wrong. Let kids be wrong. We need to really glorify wrongness, because wrongness helps people realize that they don't know everything. And so, yeah, there's some really cool things that be done in schools.
Okay, the very last question is again mine, because I've been wondering this for 23 years. How did you memorize all your students' names? If you weren't on the call at the onset, he did the most amazing thing I've ever seen. He videotaped a room of 110 students, asked them to say their name, and then the next class, he knew everyone's name. So I want to know the trick on how to do that.
You gave me too much credit. I think I did miss 3 or 4 that year. I just sat down and did it repeatedly, and my kids enjoyed it as a game as well. And so we would compete with each other. We would watch a half a dozen or 10 of these students give their names and give a little piece of information about them, and we'd run back through that 10 till we were all getting them right, and I'd move on to the next 10. And it would take 2 days usually, because the classes would be like Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And yeah, I would put a lot of time in, 3 or 4 hours, and I could learn 100 people's names. And then when you do that, you have the students eating out of your hand. They think you know who they are now. And that way they think you know when they're not in class. Now, of course, 2 weeks later, I've lost 50% of those, but they don't know that. And it's motivating. I got a kick out of it. They enjoyed it. And I think it provides motivation in a class when they think your professor really knows who they are.
No, it definitely worked. There were times I wanted to hit the snooze button, but I knew you.
I would know it. I would know it. Absolutely.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up. How about a virtual round of applause for Dr. Leary?
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate you being here. How many do we have today? How many did you have?
We had almost 60 people on the call,
wow,
which was great. A really a testament to your presentation and how interesting this was. I thought it was fantastic. In appreciation of you doing this, we're going to be making a donation in your name to Big Brothers, Big Sisters.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Wonderful.
And again, personally, I want to thank you, all the impact you've had.
Thanks
and
for
also,
the invitation.
Also, Dr. Buchanan, who's also on the call, tremendous impact on my life and my career. Again, I want to thank our Kiwanians, great crowd today. Next week, Purdue coach Matt Painter will join us, and expect another big crowd. So if you're a Kiwanian and you want to stick around for a little social hour or a couple minutes after the call, you can. Hope everybody has a great week. Be safe. And Dr. Leary, thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.